This is News for Scotland on the Scotland Channel. Scotland has taken its first step towards being recognised by the United Nations as a colony of England. The Liberation Scotland Committee has announced that it has begun the submission of Scotland's case to the United Nations Special Committee on de-colonisation. Liberation Scotland and the Geneva-based human rights organisation Justice pour tous International have formally notified the Secretary-General of the United Nations in New York and the Chair of the Bureau for the UN Special Committee on de-colonisation, that's Committee C24, of the establishment of Scotland's peaceful liberation movement. It also submitted an advance notice of petition for a formal recognition of Scotland as a non-self-governing territory under the United Nations de-colonisation framework, in accordance with the principles enshrined in the UN's General Assembly's resolutions 1415, 1441 and 1654 and Chapter 11 of the United Nations Chapter. Together, these establish the legal basis for decolonisation, independence and the right to self-determination for people under external governance. The advance notice argues that the UK government has actively obstructed Scotland's right to self-determination, contravening the UN General Assembly's Resolution 1514, which states that all peoples have the right to self-determination, and that the subjection of people to alien subjugation, domination or exploitation constitutes a denial of fundamental human rights. Professor Alf Baird, convener of Liberation Scotland, said Scotland's political and constitutional status aligns with the established international criteria to be recognised as a non-self-governing territory. The forthcoming petition aims to rectify Scotland's exclusion from the UN decolonisation agenda by formally requesting its inclusion on a list of non-self-governing territories, thereby initiating the process for Scotland's recognition as a territory entitled to self-determination and independence under the UN oversight. Professor Baird added, this is a monumental development, but necessary due to the undemocratic nature of our political system, whereby successful majorities of national politicians in Scotland have failed to deliver independence, and with the UK government continuing to block its inalienable right to self-determination. There's also the realisation that colonial exploitation and domination in Scotland and its people must be ended and can be via the UN's decolonisation process, which Liberation Scotland has now initiated. Almost all former colonies that have become independent since the creation of the UN in 1945 have done so through the UN self-determination and decolonisation process. Sarah Salyers, director of Salvo Scotland, the campaign organiser of Liberation Scotland, commented, contrary to what we in Scotland and the world at large have been led to believe, the historical incorporation of Scotland into the UK in 1707 did not constitute a voluntary partnership. She says it was never an expression of self-determination, but a process marked by political coercion, by threats of economic sanctions and military invasion and bribery. Ultimately, it saw the abandonment by England of the Treaty of Union in favour of annexation and the ongoing colonisation of Scotland. The dissolution of Scotland's independent governance structures then followed, along with the displacement of the indigenous population, the suppression of Scotland's cultures, and the colonial exploitation of Scotland's maritime and territorial assets. The denial of Scotland's democratic rights has continued ever since. By misrepresenting Scotland as a voluntary partner in the creation of the new state rather than a dependency of the English Crown, the UK government has failed to meet its responsibility under the criteria set forth by the United Nations under Resolution 1541, principles which should guide members in determining whether or not an obligation exists to transmit the information called for under Article 73E of the UN Charter. What Liberation Scotland now seeks is both internationally lawful and a fundamental human right. It's simple justice for our nation and long overdue. Sharaf Azizov, the Director General of Justice pour tous International, has commended the strength of Scotland's case. He says, the advance notice of petition convincingly argues that Scotland has lost its political autonomy and became a colony under Westminster's governance, and this and other institutions of the state have systematically eroded Scotland's constitutional distinctiveness and suppressed Scotland's rights to self-determination. Given the compelling evidence demonstrating Scotland's continued governance under external authority, its lack of full self-government, and the systematic denial of its right to self-determination, the advance notice will follow in due time with a formal request urging the C24 Committee to formally recognise Scotland as a non-self-governing territory within the UN de-colonisation framework, in accordance with legal criteria set forth in Resolution 1541 from 1960 and the principles in Resolution 1541, Section 15. The evidence presented in this submission, he says, will establish that Scotland satisfies the requirements for classification as a territory that has not yet achieved a full measure of self-governance and therefore qualifies for inclusion on a UN list of non-self-governing territories, he said. A documentary, The United Kingdom, the biggest contract in history, showing Scotland's true position in the Union, is available to watch now on the Scotland Channel. NHS England is set to lose half its staff and a huge swathe of its senior management team, which could have funding implications for NHS in Scotland. Although health is devolved in our country, funding is through the complicated formula, which means that cuts to the NHS budget in England will lead to funding cuts in Scotland too. English Health Minister Wes Streeting is axing 13,000 NHS jobs in England, with any cuts in spending there impacting on the budget for Scotland's NHS. Westminster-driven austerity is the main driver of poor health outcomes, according to former NHS surgeon Dr. Philippa Whitford. She said in a Scotland Channel documentary recently that the only way to improve health and to reduce pressure on the NHS was to reduce poverty, something which the Scottish Government has been trying to do. But without independence, the Scottish Government and the Scottish NHS are working with one hand tied behind their backs because continuing austerity is leading to greater poverty and poor health outcomes. And without control over its overall budget, the Scottish Government cannot eradicate poverty completely in Scotland. Our documentary, Condition Critical: Saving Scotland's NHS, is available to watch now on the Scotland Channel. The UK government in London announced last week that the windfall tax on oil and gas will run out by 2030. This temporary measure was brought in by the last Conservative government because the energy companies were making extra unearned profits from the higher world prices. The UK aims to start looking at a new permanent tax system for the North Sea revenues, which are mostly in Scotland's waters. Historically, neither Scotland nor the UK has seen much benefit from our oil industry, not when you compare Britain with Norway. Back in the 1970s, Norway was a relatively poor country, but with a desire to use their economy to work for the population. So when the commercial oil deposits were found in the Norwegian sector, their government made it a principle that the oil money was to build a better society. To bring this about, the Norwegian government nationalised oil, retaining a more than 50% share in their oil industry. To begin with, the UK Labour government put Scotland's oil sector under the control of a BNOC, and then Brit Oil. However, the Conservative government of Margaret Thatcher from 1979 onwards sold these public assets off due to their ideological belief that the private sector knew better what to do with our massive oil wealth. Now, Norway is one of the richest countries in the world and one of our most contented societies too. The sale of our oil companies did indeed bring cash into the government at the time, bringing in a reported $1 billion, but this short-term one-off boost to the Tory administration was paid for over the years by the loss of long-term revenue. One study suggests we could have enjoyed at least $400 billion more if we had followed the Norwegian system. If the UK had created a national savings fund like Norway, it might be today worth something like 400 million or even double that, according to various different estimates. Norway did set up a savings account called their Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is now worth about $1.4 trillion. Oil has transformed Norway with less oil and gas than the British sector. According to the National Resource Governance Institute, since the 1970s, the UK government has received about $11 a barrel from oil, while the Norwegian government gets about 30. And that's the other reason why the Norwegian population can actually see the benefits of some of their oil bounty. Tax revenues last year totaled 1.2 trillion in Norway, compared to the UK's pathetic 400 billion. And these estimates actually weren't last year, they were from a couple of years ago, so there's obviously even more lost since then. However, 400 billion plus inflation is still a lot of dosh, so what did the two governments spend it on? As we've seen, Norway invested their oil cash on building up their country. Their wealth fund has been carefully invested, allowing the government to use some of the interest every year to build up the health and education without shrinking the total value of the capital. So it's still there for the future. In the UK, oil money was used for tax cuts, which mainly benefited richer people. Of course, we now have to think about the climate effects of burning too much carbon-based fuel, which releases CO2 into the atmosphere, trapping in more of the sun's heat. But Norway, too, is ahead of us there. They're investing in clean, renewable energy and have more electric cars per capita than other countries. That's because the government has enough in reserve to subsidise the price. So when the Labour government in London gets round to planning its tax policy for oil, maybe they should reflect on a half a century of subsidies we've already given them. As we reported last week, the Labour government 50 years ago knew that Scotland would have been as rich as Norway had we been an independent country then. Production of oil and gas has now peaked, although there's still plenty left. The next North Sea bonanza is based, of course, on wind, wave and tidal resources, possibly linked to carbon capture storage or the production of green hydrogen. Now, if Scotland was independent, we could be taxing those legacy energy companies to prepare for the next energy revolution. Can we leave that strategic choice to Labour in London? Scotland's former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon announced this week that she will not run in Scotland's next election. Having been deputy leader under Alex Salmond, Sturgeon took over unelected as party leader and therefore Scotland's First Minister following the defeat of the independence referendum in 2014. She then led the SNP to victory in all UK and Scottish general elections from 2015 onwards. As First Minister during the COVID crisis, January 20 till May 23, her regular public briefings were eagerly watched by many, and not just in Scotland, but also south of the border, where many people found her clarity and grasp of detail a refreshing contrast to the lack of interest shown by UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson. That period was the peak of Sturgeon's popularity, but she failed to use it to further the cause of independence. She announced that the second independence referendum would be in October 2023, but this never happened. The Scottish Government took their case to the Supreme Court in London, asking if Scotland had the legal authority to hold its own referendum without Westminster's permission. To no one's surprise, the answer was no. The Sturgeon-led government ended 22 with the longest and probably most controversial Holyrood debate when, in a series of extended sittings, the Scottish Parliament passed a gender self-ID bill, which never became law. As this bill would have affected the UK Equality Act of 2010, it was overruled by the Scottish Secretary. So the bill has no legal standing, but under Scottish Government guidelines, public bodies here have behaved as if self-ID was the law. Shortly after the failed bill debate, the Scottish Prison Service remanded a convicted rapist, Adam Graham, in a women's prison. This is because the criminal, who now calls himself Isla Bryson, changed his name while awaiting trial. This decision, soon reversed, caused a huge debate not just in Scotland, and shortly after, in March 23, Sturgeon resigned her post as First Minister. Later that year, she was arrested as part of an investigation into possible criminal use of SNP funds. This continues with no criminal charges against Ms Sturgeon, but the financial crisis in her party could be connected to the large drop in SNP membership from an estimated peak of around 125,000 members to possibly 75,000 now, as the party also lost most of their MPs in the July 24 general election. The SNP have now lost millions in parliamentary expenses. Hamza Yousaf, her successor, said on X that she was one of the most talented politicians of our generation and that he was personally grateful for her advice, trust and friendship over the years. John Swinney said he was very sorry that Sturgeon was stepping down and thanked her for her extraordinary contribution to Scottish politics. Sturgeon, he said, had many different policy achievements to be proud of in changing the lives of people in Scotland for the better. Tess White, MSP for the Conservatives, said Nicola Sturgeon leaves a dangerous and divisive legacy for Scotland. She took a sledgehammer to women's rights, and her government presided over the ideological capture of children and young people. For this and for so much more, she will not be missed. Susan Dalgetty, journalist, said, "Farewell, Nicola Sturgeon. Your legacy is a divided Scotland where women and girls are denied their basic human rights to own their own identity." The UK Labour government in London is looking for ways to balance the books and is reported to be considering cutting welfare benefits for disabled people. In England, the system has a personal independence payment, that's a PIP. In Scotland, the equivalent payment is the adult disability payment, and this will not be included in any UK Labour cuts, although Scotland's funding through the Barnett formula could be reduced in future. And meantime, the disability element of universal credit, which is a UK-wide benefit, could be cut here too. UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer announced earlier this week his intention to cut the welfare bill to Labour MPs when he spoke in Westminster, saying that the welfare system is the worst of both worlds. It's unfair and discourages people from seeking work. In Scotland, the local leader Anna Sarwar defended Starmer's approach, saying, "We have to get more people into work and we have to make sure that we have the public finances on a sustainable footing." Last year, during the July election campaign, Sarwar said on TV debates, "Read my lips, no austerity under Labour." In the Scottish Parliament last week, Shirley-Ann Somerville for the Scottish Government described Labour's reported cuts as turbocharged austerity on the backs of some of our most vulnerable constituents. Labour are struggling in the polls now following a series of unpopular economic decisions, and with just over a year left till the Scottish elections, some MPs are breaking ranks. Brian Leishman, Labour MP for Alloa and Grangemouth, has vowed to oppose these appalling welfare cuts. Posting in X, he said, "Such a move could consign the most vulnerable people in our country into forever poverty." Another Labour critic, Prem Sikka, who's in the House of Lords, also posted an X saying the government could bring in plenty of cash to cover the welfare bill if unearned income was taxed at the same rate as wages. Sikka, who is a professor of accounting, pointed out that tax rates on profits and dividends are lower than income tax. On top of that, it's only wage incomes which attract national insurance. Bringing these into line could rake in an extra 28 billion. Professor Sikka also has another handy tip for the Prime Minister too. People at work get tax relief on their pension contributions, a good thing, but again, ordinary workers get less. Nearly 2/3 of that tax relief went to the higher rate taxpayers. Again, if the tax relief was given to all at the same basic rate, a subsidy for the better off would go, and the government could rake in another 14.5 billion. The cuts Labour are expected to announce are only to save 6 billion, so equalising these rates could easily bring in far more than that. As Scotland isn't independent, we can't stop Labour's cuts, and our government already has to balance its budget. But do we need to punish the poor to force them into work? Anna Sarwar argues we need to get to the root cause of what's holding so many people back from getting the opportunities they deserve. But instead of investigating those causes, he's supporting a policy that will simply take money away from them. So we'll know more about Labour's austerity plans when the UK Finance Minister, Rachel Reeves, presents her spring budget in a couple of weeks. Shetland fishing industry leaders have hit out at guidance given to First Minister John Swinney ahead of his visit to Shetland last year, advising him not to use the term spatial squeeze when describing the use of sea around the Isles. A briefing note released by the Scottish Government through a Freedom of Information request said the term is a narrative advanced by the industry regarding the use of shared marine space, which the Scottish Government says must be done in a way which delivers for the whole of Scotland rather than just one local industry. The Shetland Fishermen's Association Executive Officer Daniel Lawson is reported to have said the briefing note is not constructive and does nothing to inspire faith in government processes. And the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, the SFF, said it was disgraceful that officials briefed the First Minister not to recognise their deeply held concerns for their future livelihoods. The note was designed to brief First Minister Swinney ahead of his visit in October last year, which included engagement with the fishing and aquaculture sectors as well as Lerwick Port Authority. The briefing note gave background information and a messaging from government on related topics including offshore wind development and the industry supply chain. The guidance included a section on shared marine space, an issue which is deeply concerning to the local fishing industry, given that offshore wind farms proposed to the east of Shetland would cut into some prime fishing grounds, which say the fishermen who believe their industry is being pushed out of their traditional fishing grounds. The briefing note to Mr. Swinney said, if industry use language in relation to spatial squeeze, we suggest that you do not mirror or repeat back that language. First Minister Swinney spoke about marine spatial planning while addressing concerns over offshore wind farms. The briefing note added, this is a narrative advanced by the industry which we do not share, given the use of our shared marine space must be done in a way that delivers for the whole of Scotland and balances across environmental, social and economic interests. A 2023 report which found that over half of Scotland's seas stand to be closed to trawling by 2050 if fishing continues to be marginalised in favour of other activities and developments. The Scottish Fishermen's Federation said, it's disgraceful that when it plans systematically and permanently to exclude fishermen from traditional fishing grounds to build colossal offshore wind farms, that Scottish Government officials briefed the First Minister not to recognise their deeply held concerns for their future livelihoods. It went on, the spatial squeeze is not an imaginary concept dreamt up by fishermen, but a real and active force that the report carried out for the SFF has shown will exclude the trawling fleet from 50% of the fishing grounds by 2050. In response, the Scottish Government said, we recognise there's increased competition for marine space and there is valid concern from those engaged in existing marine activities. The National Marine Plan 2, that's the NMP2, will help to address the increasing competition for marine space in future and working in partnership with the fisheries sector to ensure an open dialogue in developing NMP2. The government continued, the views of fishers are important to us and we are keen to hear their views as we continue to develop this draft plan. Clean energy isn't just part of Scotland's future, it's already generating most of Scotland's electricity. Our country now has renewable capacity of over 1,600 megawatts and production has been increasing steadily over the last 20 years. Now, this week, our energy capital Aberdeen hosted the Renewable Energy Supply Chain Conference, bringing together manufacturers and supply chain companies to help keep Scotland at the front of the worldwide transition away from climate-changing fossil fuels. Emma Harrick from Scottish Renewables said, Scotland, long hailed as the energy capital of Europe, stands on the brink of an exciting new era with a legacy rooted in oil and gas. Our nation is now leading the charge in renewable energy, unlocking a monumental economic opportunity that will power not just Scotland but the entire UK for generations to come. The conference was set up to bring companies together. Local suppliers had the chance to meet with the big industry purchasers to find out how they can be part of this growing sector. Among the firms present were Hitachi Energy, Tarmac, Ocean Winds and the Port of Inverness. The majority of Scotland's renewable electricity now comes from land-based wind turbines, followed by offshore wind and then hydro, altogether generating the equivalent of 97% of Scotland's electricity needs, without releasing harmful CO2, the main gas behind the greenhouse effect, which is changing the planet's atmosphere and causing more storms, floods and wildfires. And when you add in nuclear, hardly any of Scotland's electricity is now made from burning coal, oil or gas. In fact, the amount of CO2 avoided came to, for example, 11.2 million tonnes in 2021. News4Scotland reported earlier this week that Reform UK wants to stop progress to net zero because they think human-induced climate change isn't happening. Well, it is. Potential Reform voters should think about the growth in employment already seen in our successful renewable sector. Latest estimates from Strathclyde Uni's Fraser Ravallander Institute show that Scotland's renewable industry supports 42,000 jobs and generated 10 billion worth of economic output. That's based on figures from 21. The majority of the jobs are in wind power or hydro. For every person directly employed in the green energy sector, between 2 and 3 other jobs are created. These extra jobs come in both suppliers of spare parts, equipment or services, and also in what the economists call induced jobs, when workers spend their wages in the local economy. For example, in 21, there were 13,600 people directly employed in renewables, but another 16,790 indirectly employed in support roles, and spending from these jobs produced another 12,500 induced jobs. So from an initial employment of 13,600, a total of 43,000 jobs were created in Scotland's green energy sector. A project to connect Shetland to the UK national grid has been given a boost with the arrival of 2 new transformers in Lerwick. Scottish and Southern Energy Networks said the transformers, each weighing around 59 tonnes, were the largest components in the project to be delivered. Once fully installed, these transformers will ensure the site's ability to handle current and future electricity demand. The 2 units arrived in Lerwick Harbour's Greenhead base before being carefully loaded onto a multi-axle vehicle by the specialist hauliers RRS and transported to their final location, the new Grimster Grid Supply Point, the GGSP. The arrival of these transformers is a significant step forward in the new Grimster Grid Supply Point and wider Grimster connection projects, which will strengthen the energy infrastructure here in Shetland, said a spokesperson for the SSEN transmission. The SSEN's Grimster to Cairngorm connection project involves creating a 22-kilometre connection between the new Grimster GSP and the Cairngorm substation, which was completed in 2024 as part of a Shetland high voltage direct current link using a combination of overhead line and underground cabling. Once completed, the Cairngorm-Grimster link will provide a connection to Shetland's local electricity distribution network, connecting the islands to the UK grid for the first time and helping secure Shetland's future electricity supply. The Cairngorm-Grimster link is expected to be completed by the end of this year 25, with Shetland fully connected to the mainland national grid following the commissioning, testing and energising of SSEN's distribution standby solution in the first half of 2026. And that rounds up our stories for this week. Join us again from 7 p.m. next Friday for independent news without the mainstream media bias. Support us by subscribing to the Scotland channel on youtube.com/the Scotland channel. I'm Hugh, thanks for watching.